The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as religion, sports, aviation, business, literature, and music. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they've been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is the legendary jazz trumpeter Joe Wilder, classical trumpeter, jazz trumpeter, and he's going to be talking with us about his remarkable career in the music business. Welcome to African American Legends, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Now, you started in the music business by your father, who had a band in Philadelphia. Could you tell us how that evolved into you being this great trumpeter?
Right. You know, a lot of people mention that my father had a band. They say this, but they don't realize he did not have a band at the time I was a little kid coming up. He was playing with different bands around Philadelphia. My dad had originally played cornet, and then for some reason or other, he decided he wanted to try the sousaphone, and he fell in love with the sousaphone and became very proficient at it.
For the audience, what is a sousaphone?
The sousaphone is the bass tuba.
That's what I thought.
And the sousaphone is named for
After
John Philip Sousa,
because
because it was the first time they used the one that you curled around and the bell was over your head. But then he became very proficient in playing the sousaphone, and at that time, the tuba players began to study the bass violin, and my dad got a bass violin and took lessons and started studying that, and so he became a doubler, played the sousaphone and the bass fiddle. And so he worked with a lot of other people, but it was him who decided that I should play cornet. He got a cornet for me. I guess I was almost 11 years old, and started me on that.
Well, in those days in the black community, there were many jazz and music bands. Because of the segregation,
Right.
They couldn't play in the white establishments, but they played at all the various social clubs,
That's
the Elks
true.
and so on.
That's true.
And they were very, very popular and very, very well known in that particular community. So you started with a tradition of somebody who was known in the music business.
That's true too, fortunately.
Now, how did you transition into being a jazz trumpeter and a classical trumpeter?
Well, I started off, the fellow with whom my dad studied was a black cornet soloist, and his name was Frederick D. Griffin, and he was in Philadelphia. He was a fantastic cornet soloist, and what he used to do at WPEM, the radio station in Philadelphia, sometimes they had no commercial booking or anything, gaps of maybe 2 hours or whatever, and they would ask Mr. Griffin to come down and play like the Herbert Clark cornet solos and things. He and his accomplice was a gentleman named Franklin Hoxter. He was a concert pianist, and they would play for whatever time they needed to fill the gap that they had in their programming. And he was a fine cornet
This was
soloist.
in the 1930s, I remember.
This is in the 30s. And my dad, as a matter of fact, I think my father, I think he was paying something like 50 cents a lesson for me to study with Mr. Griffin. I had studied with a couple other people who weren't on his level, and that's why I got started playing classical things, because we were studying from the famous Arbin trumpet study book, you know. And
But then after the service, or maybe before the service, you started playing with some of the big bands.
before I went into the service, right?
Now, who'd you play with?
I played with I was playing with some of the bands around Philadelphia, like Jimmy Gorham's band and Lonnie Slappy's band, those smaller groups, and the Harlem Dictators. They were all smaller groups. But I joined Les Heights band, and that was the first well-known band that I played with. And I was in that band for a while. I left them and went to Lionel Hampton's band. Carl George, the first trumpet player, was getting a divorce and had to go to St. Louis, and they needed somebody to cover just the period of his absence, and they decided they would hire me. And I was playing with Les Heights, and we were playing in Washington, D.C. at the Howard Theater. And this was just after Dizzy Gillespie and Cab Calloway had an altercation, and they fired Dizzy on the spot. So Les Height hired Dizzy and added him to the trumpet section.
Well, the thing that you probably don't know is that I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I used to
you
go
did?
to the Howard Theater.
Oh, right.
And I used to see these various legendary bands.
Right,
like
right.
Jimmy Lunsford and Les Height and Count Basie.
We were in Howard Theater, and Dizzy Gillespie was in Les Height's band at that time. And Les was out front. He would have his back turned to the band. He's dancing. He had his alto saxophone around his neck, and he'd be dancing. And Dizzy was in the trumpet section. We're elevated, so we're up above all the other guys in the band. And Dizzy would imitate every move that Les made.
That's Dizzy.
And the people were cracking up. And Les, not knowing what was going on behind, thought that he was really getting to the people. He was very proud of that. And he turned around. We'd been there 2 or 3 days, and Dizzy was still doing it. And he happened to turn around all of a sudden, quickly than he had done in the past, and he saw, and Dizzy couldn't sit down quick enough to be sitting there looking at us. He got so mad, and he just said to everybody when we finished that show, "Everybody's fired. You have 2 weeks notice. That's it. You're gone." And so we said, "Okay." And then on Friday or Saturday, when we went in to get paid, we used to go into the room where the band leader was. We paid each of us individually
In cash.
Les Height, and he said, incidentally, he said, "You know, that notice doesn't go for you." He said, "I'm trying to get rid of Dizzy." He said, "You know what happened between him and Cab? He cut Cab." And he said, "And I can't take any chances, so I fired the whole band." He said, "But that notice only goes for Dizzy, and I'm just telling you guys as you come in." So I told him, I said, "Well, it's too late because I got a call from someone asking me if I joined Lionel Hampton's band, and I'm going to join the band." And that was it.
Well, as a young man with this great skill, to be wooed by these great band leaders must have been quite something. You must have been quite attractive to you to say, "Well, look, the Count Basie wants me,
Right.
Billy Eckstine wants me." How does that go?
Yeah, it was a boost to your ego, but you had to also recognize the fact that how fortunate I was, because there were a lot of other trumpet players around who could do just about anything I could do, and I didn't know much about improvisation. My forte was that I could sight read very well. I could read well. And
that's an interesting point, because at one time it was said that many of the jazz musicians didn't sight read.
That's true.
But as now everybody sight reads, and you had the advantage of having this classical training, so they could lay out a chart and you could play anything right on the spot.
That's true.
But what about the arrangements? Each band had their own particular style. Jimmy Lunsford had his style, Lucky Millinder had his style, Count Basie had his style. How did you adapt to that?
It takes a little time. Now, for instance, when I left Les Height's band, that was like a society kind of a band. So we played jazz and everything, but it was more subdued. And when I joined Lionel Hampton's band, this was, of course, a band that was on fire, and anything they touched just swung, you know.
Was that because of Lionel?
It was Lionel and the kind of people he had in the band, because he had Illinois Jacquet, who played Flying Home.
He just passed away recently.
Right, he just passed away. And they had a style. They also had a guy who had a lot to do with that band being as stylish as it was. That was Milton Buckner, who played the locked hand piano style and was a creative arranger, and tremendous. He was one of the guys that helped establish the style of that band at that time.
Well, what contribution did Lionel have to it? Because I know he played the vibes and the drums and everything. But what about actually setting the pace of the band?
He was a tremendous player insofar as improvisation was concerned. I mean, he had good ears and had dexterity on his instrument, and of course that being the instrument out front changed the style of the band too. Gave it a different kind of a spirit.
What about playing with Count Basie?
Count Basie was when I joined Count Basie's band, it was to give Joe Newman, who was there, the trumpet player who was doing all the improvisations, and he had so much to do that he told Count, you know, we need to get somebody else in here to help, because the other guys were playing their parts, but they didn't do much. They didn't improvise at all, basically. And so someone recommended, I think it was Renald Jones, recommended me to Count, and Count said, "Well, okay, I'll call him." And he had me come down and rehearse with the band, and they added me to the band. That was a good band to play in, too. Count was great.
I heard the story that you weren't getting any solos, and you decided that you were going to write Count a note that he wanted to do a solo, and they gave it to him. And what did he say?
I had been in the band. I'd been in the band about 6 weeks, I guess, and during that 6-week period, all I did was play some lead parts and some other parts. I had no solos or anything. And finally, I got frustrated, and I said, geez, I've got to do something. And I wrote a note, and I passed it to Marshall Royal, who gave it to Count, who was playing the piano. And he stopped while he was playing. The band's still playing. He opened up, and he looked up at me, and he said, "You want to play? Play." And I had written on the note, dear Count, could I have 16 bars of anything? And I signed it, the trumpet player second from the drums. And basically had a good sense of humor. He thought
He was
it
a
was funny.
very, very interesting man. Very, very. Now, tell us a little about the discrimination that you and the black jazz musicians and the black bands were facing in the 40s, 50s, almost into the 60s.
Right. Well, I began to run into it early because I went to the Tilden Junior High School in Philadelphia, and I was playing in the orchestra there. And we had a very good orchestra. We had our music teacher was Miss Alberta Schenbecker at that time, and she was a very accomplished pianist and musician, and she had us playing operettas and things like that. So the orchestra was way out in front of most of the junior high school orchestras in Philadelphia. And we were invited to play at a Catholic school on Elmwood Avenue in Philly. And we went there, and I was the only black kid in the orchestra. And we went in, the principal looked at, she saw me and said, "Who is he?" And she said, he's our first trumpet player. She said, "Of all the people, why would you bring a nigger into our school?" You know, I mean, and Mrs. Lewis, as she became later, was so frustrated. She just looked at her. She said, "Well, would you rather I take the orchestra and leave?" And she kind of embarrassed her, and then she sort of backed off of it. But I ran into that kind of a thing early, as many others did too.
See, in 2004, it's almost inconceivable that happened, although there's more subtle racism, as you and I both know.
Right.
And to have survived this as long and have to maintain your career and your equanimity is absolutely remarkable.
It is.
Now, your 80th birthday, a year or so ago, you cut a CD. And the CD had some great people on it, Bucky Pizzarella and Frank West, great saxophone player.
Right.
So I thought it'd be interesting to just hear one of those pieces, Centerpiece.
Oh, that's right.
Isn't that something else, Joe? You fellas have the best of all worlds. You're working in a field that you enjoy, and people respond to you so well.
That's true. That's true.
So tell us about your classical career. You told me that you were one of the first to play in the Philharmonic trumpet.
Right. No, I subbed with them a couple of times. It sounds like I only mentioned it mainly because at the time that it happened, it was so unusual.
There were no blacks.
Right. And I played with subbed with the Philharmonic. They used to play the Pines of Rome, and they added either two or three trumpets. And that's the first time I played with them when Boulez this was Andre Castellanos was the conductor at that time. And I played with him a couple of times under Boulez.
Then you played with the Firestone Orchestra for those Firestone concerts. Used to be on the radio and television.
Right, we were doing that on television at ABC.
And I understand that because you were African American, they didn't want to show your face, and they showed your trumpet instead.
We were playing Bugler's Holiday, bum 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 bum, da 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 bum 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 bum. We were playing this, and they were featuring the trumpet section at ABC. There were four of us, and so I thought nothing of it. When I got home, I said to my wife, "Did you see the program?" She said, "Yes." She said, "But you know, they never showed you." She said, I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "They used my arms. We have the horn up like this, and they shot through the fold of my elbows and focused on the other three trumpet players." And I knew a couple of the cameramen there very well, I mean, intimately. And I mentioned it to one of the guys. He said the Firestone people didn't want to show a black player on their program, and so they just used my arms to frame the other guys. And I mean, it was so ludicrous, but that's what they did. Then you know, on Voice of Firestone, they usually had the tenor or baritone sang with the soprano, and Leontyne Price was on the show, and Robert Merrill, and they had rehearsed a duet or a couple duets that they were to play, they were to sing. And somebody all of a sudden got the idea that, you know, this won't work because this program goes to the South, and they won't like the idea of a white male and a black woman singing together. And so they decided not to do the duet. And then after they ran through the program, they were short of things that they had to perform. And they decided, well, they'd reinstate the duet. And Leontyne Price said, I am not singing a duet at all. We rehearsed, you didn't want us to do it, and now I'm not doing it, and I'm going down as the highest paid soprano on Firestone for doing one aria, you know.
See, being in the artistic world, I'm sure that many of the whites who were carrying out these discriminatory acts knew how talented you and Leontyne and others were. What was their reaction? Was it sort of a resignation, or was there anger? 'Cause I know in the 70s it got to be anger about
That's
it.
true.
But what about in the 50s and 60s? What was it? Resignation?
The people, a lot of them were resigned to it, and they accepted it the way it was. But there were others who fought it, because when I went on the road,
Artie Shaw was one. Artie Shaw.
He was one of the first to fight it. I mean, openly, and because he tells the story about how when Billie Holiday was singing with a band, they traveled through the South, and the farmers and those jokers would come to the ballroom, and they'd be calling her a black this or that from the audience, and of course she would answer too. She wasn't going to sit there and smile at it, you know. But there was a great deal of that, and yet there were some people who fought it. There were some people who helped. When I did the Cole Porter show, Silk Stockings, we went on the road. We were in Philadelphia, for instance, and we used there was a rehearsal hall there called the Lulu Temple, and we used their facilities for all the rehearsals while we were preparing to open the show in the Schubert Theater in Philadelphia. And on opening night, before opening night, they sent a letter of introduction to us and invited the road company, all the people in the Stars and so forth, to their hall for an opening night party. And we had one black lady who was in the wardrobe department, and the head electrician was Japanese. I think his name was Saki. And they specifically said, but no Negroes or Japanese were to be invited to come to this party. And Donna Michi, Hildegard Knef, Cy Feuer, and Ernie Martin, who were the producers, they all said, if anybody in this cast goes to that party, he's automatically fired. And they took a stand. They really took a stand. And that's another place where I heard the expression of all the trumpet players in New York, why would you bring a nigger over here? You know, this is what the contractor said to the road contractor when we went to Philadelphia, my hometown.
You see, you've been in the music business for over 60 years. How have you been able to maintain your optimism and your enthusiasm during the time of all of these slaps in the face?
Right.
How have you been able to do that?
I think I wasn't aware of it at the time. And you have a picture of Jackie Robinson here, and I must say that when I heard that expression I just related to you about the contract in Philadelphia, my first inclination was to jump all over the guy. And then I thought, in the back of my head, well, Jackie Robinson had to put up with even a lot more than this. I mean, it was nothing compared to what he did. And I thought, I'm more intelligent than this idiot who's saying what he's saying, and I'm not going to come down to his level. And I just ignored it. And then, of course, after he found out, the same thing happened in Boston, almost verbatim. As soon as he found out that I was qualified or capable of doing what they wanted me to do, then he wanted to befriend me. And I just ignored him. I never had anything at all to do with it. But I think mainly, Dr. Brown, that it came from my having grown up in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, where I did. And as I said, there were like 6 black families in Carl Wynn, where I was born. And I guess from that time, because we weren't even aware that we were different from anybody else. I mean, it wasn't pointed out to us, and nobody bothered us with it until many years later when we moved into Philadelphia proper. But I think that makes a big difference, because what happened was, when I'd run into something like that, in the back of my mind, I could always remember that I knew people who were also white, who were not at all racist or anything like that, and it would always bring me to a halt where I was just about ready to explode. I'd kind of sit back and say, well, wait a minute, I knew so-and-so's family, and so-and-so, they weren't like this, you know.
What message would you give to the youth of today? Because many of the lower-income blacks and some middle are so angry that they're not able to mobilize themselves, and they carry out behaviors that really are self-destructive. What message, if you were talking to youth, what message would you give them today?
Well, one of the things I think I would say, I would tell them not to let people who tend to not to want you in their company or want to retard your progress, not to let them defeat you, because they have a way of suggesting, say we're all born with a certain natural talent and so forth, and if given a chance to develop it, we can be equal to anybody else. The thing of it is, you get a lot of negative responses from people who are supposed to be educating you. And I remember when I was in junior high school in Philadelphia, and we were asked what courses we wanted to take, whether you wanted to take a commercial course, an academic, or an industrial course, and they would say, take an industrial course because you can get a job right away. You'll be able to feed yourself and so forth. And this was to divert you away from the other courses, which were much more beneficial to you later on. It took a little more time to get the results from them, but I think this is one of the things, and it was always somebody trying to discourage you from doing the things that would be of more benefit to you. And you have to get to the point where you make up your mind, I'm not going to succumb to that. It's not going to happen. And I remembered when guys, even in Lionel's band, there were some guys, I was always practicing. I had the Arbin book, and I had listened to a lot of classical things, so I see these things in the book, and I couldn't play them. I mean, I wasn't playing them professionally, but I was working, practicing them all the time. And some of the guys said, why do you keep playing them? Why don't you stop, you know? And then I just ignored it, and I practiced and practiced. Then finally, when it got to a place, some points where I had to play something like that, I was able to do it, but only because I had been practicing and didn't give up on myself, you know. And this doesn't make me a genius. This is just something that you have to learn to do.
As we come to the close of the program today, I want to ask you a difficult question. What is your favorite recording?
Of mine, or just
of yours?
I think basically the Pretty Sound. I made that's with Columbia, and the Columbia record, and I did also another recording for them called Peter Gunn, the music from the Peter Gunn show. Those two shows, but the Pretty Sound was the first time that I had the opportunity to select what I wanted to play and have it arranged basically the way I thought it would work out. And the arranger was a fellow named Michael Colicchio, very creative, and had ideas that were unlike anybody else's, especially for a small group. And he did a great job for us. Then the other thing was I had a chance to do a classical album for which Alec Wilder wrote a sonata for me, a trumpet sonata. And then we played that on one side of the album, and on the other side we did some transcribed violin pieces. So I had some good opportunities, you know.
You're now, of all the musicians who played jazz, who do you think was the best? Other than you, of course.
It's kind of hard to say. You know, they're like, first of all, I guess we'd have to go back. Well, Louis Armstrong.
Louis, that's the one. Everybody.
He's above everybody else. I mean, because if you listen to Louis Armstrong's recordings, these are things in the 20s, in the 30s, and the things that he's playing, I mean, you stop and you say, well, how could he possibly have thought of playing something like that? And yet, from what he played, we either tried to play that and develop something of our own. And then you had people like Roy Eldridge, who came in with a little more modern style, and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, who came in with their more extensive harmonic approaches to things. I mean, it's kind of hard to say, but then there were guys like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Shavers, and then there were white players too, Billy Butterfield, even Harry James, and guys like some of these guys, Shorty Sharrock. Some of these guys were fantastic. And they all sort of developed their own thing as they came along, you know.
Joe, I really want to thank you for giving us this history of jazz in the 20th century and about your contribution. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with the legendary jazz trumpeter, Joe Wilder. Thanks for being with us, Joe.